Pressure controlled ventilation is commonly used to manage patients with acute hypoxic respiratory failure. Core to the understanding of how this is a useful mode is understanding what mean airway pressure is and how you can achieve a higher mean airway pressure while still ventilating the patient. So this is part 2 of our primary principles of pressure control. Tutorial 22. Pressure control modes of ventilation. This tutorial is the primary principles of pressure control, part 2. Welcome back. In the previous tutorial, I started talking about pressure control, and I call that tutorial primary principles, part 1. And these are really the fundamentals that you need to know. I started off with a discussion about the correct terminology, separating out the pressure limit, the inspiratory pressure, and the driving pressure. The inspiratory pressure and the driving pressure are different because the inspiratory pressure includes the Auto-PEEP and the driving pressure does not. I also discussed the concept of the pressure ramp and how that ramp impacts tidal volumes. And tidal volumes can vary depending on lung compliance, airway resistance, and of course patient positioning. We discussed the setting up of the inspiratory time and the expiratory time and how these interface with the respiratory rate. And finally, I discussed the inspiratory rise time that is common to all pressure control modes of ventilation. This time, I'm going to move on to discuss a really important concept, and that is mean airway pressure. I'm then going to move to looking at ventilation perfusion mismatch during inspiration and how prolonging inspiration and pressure control improves oxygenation. Finally, I'll discuss mean airway pressure and how it can be controlled in volume control versus pressure control. Let's go back to the ICU. Remember Frank, who is 59 and has acute hypoxic respiratory failure. He has a history of smoking and alcohol abuse and has bilateral infiltrates on his chest x-ray. Now, originally he was given high-flow nasal oxygen, he was then given CPAP, and he was intubated. Subsequently, he was paralyzed with neuromuscular blocking agents and started on volume assist control ventilation. Initial settings were a tidal volume of 450 mils, a PEEP of 15, and a respiratory rate of 20 breaths per minute. Now, at this stage, his peak airway pressure is 34 centimeters of water, his plateau pressure is 30 centimeters of water, and his PaO2-FiO2 ratio is 90. Now that's quite low. Normally it's about 400 for most people. Anything less than 100 is severe hypoxemia. So you're being pushed to do something because everybody is worried about this patient. So what are we going to do? Firstly, let's have a discussion about what exactly peak and plateau pressure is. Now remember, Frank is on volume control ventilation and his waveform looks like this. You can see that he's on constant flow volume cycle ventilation and the duration of the breath is determined by the peak flow. The airway pressure that's being measured here is the peak pressure, and that's 34 centimeters of water. In order to measure the plateau pressure, and that is the pressure the alveoli see, you need to insert an inspiratory pause. And when we do this, you can see that the pressure waveform drifts downwards to a plateau and it sits there, and this is a lower pressure level than the peak pressure. But you'll also note that in volume control ventilation, the tidal volume stays the same. So what are the peak and plateau pressures? This is a cartoon of a lung unit. The cylinder represents the conducting airways and the circle the lung parenchyma, mostly alveoli. To the right, I'm going to display airway pressures. The y-axis is the airway pressure, I call that the PaW, and the x-axis is time. When the breath is delivered, the pressure waveform goes from 0 or from PEEP to peak airway pressure almost immediately. This principally reflects resistance in the endotracheal tube and major airways. A bit like water passing through a hose pipe, the pressure is highest in the pipe. Once the gas moves into the alveoli, the greater surface area results in the drop in the pressure. This is like the tip of a hose pipe. And the pressure remains there at this lower pressure for the duration of inspiration, and this is the plateau pressure. It is sometimes called the alveolar pressure because it is the pressure that is being seen by the lung parenchyma. In order to measure airway pressure correctly, there must be an inspiratory pause. This always occurs in pressure control ventilation, but in volume control you must apply this pause so that the breath becomes time cycled rather than volume cycled. Let's put Frank on pressure control. We will try and match his settings: a 1.5 second inspiratory time, a plateau pressure of 30, a driving pressure of 20 centimeters of water, and a PEEP of 10. We're going to use a rise time of 50% to carefully craft the pressure waveform. As you can see, there really is no difference between the peak and the plateau pressure here. Functionally, there's no real difference between the two breaths, whether Frank is on pressure control versus volume control. And the only difference you will actually see is this higher peak pressure that is technically and usually clinically irrelevant. It's the plateau pressure that matters. And here's the thing. Plateau pressure is a really important concept in critical care. Based on decades of research, we know that applying a distending pressure of more than 30 centimeters of water to the alveolar surface in most patients, in most circumstances, regardless of age, gender, or race, results in an excessive stretch of lung parenchyma and may result in lung injury, particularly if the lungs are already damaged. There is clear evidence of this in the situation like Frank's, whose lungs have extensive disease, that excessive lung stretch increases mortality. So, managing a patient like Frank, we're stuck with a plateau pressure limit of 30 centimeters of water. So we cannot go further up on his airway pressure. So how do we manage his ventilator to try and get a bit more oxygen into his blood? Well, it's important to understand that we have three factors to work with. We have pressure, we have volume, and we have time. In the following scenarios, we are going to put a patient on pressure control ventilation with a PEEP of 5 and an inspiratory pressure that also equals the driving pressure, and that's 15 centimeters of water. So these are fairly standard settings to start with. The patient is going to receive 15 breaths per minute, and in this scenario, the inspiratory time is 1 second. Now what you can see very quickly is that with this 1 second inspiratory time and 15 breaths per minute, then the expiratory time is 3 seconds. And that makes the total cycle time 4 seconds. That is 60 divided by 15, which equals 4. So far, we have identified two different pressures: PEEP, which is applied continuously, and driving pressure, which is applied intermittently and held for the duration of inspiration. In pressure control, that pressure is rectangular shaped, and the area under that curve is the pressure time component. I want to introduce you to a third pressure, the mean airway pressure, that takes into account the PEEP, the inspiratory pressure, the inspiratory time, and the total respiratory cycle time. In this situation, the mean airway pressure is 8.75 centimeters of water. How did I figure that out? Well, there's a calculation for it, of course. And this is the calculation for mean airway pressure in pressure control. I'm titling this Pmaw to avoid confusion. The calculation is slightly different for volume control, that is volume cycled, because of the shape of the area under the pressure curve. You remember that's kind of triangular rather than rectangular. The mean airway pressure essentially is the inspiratory pressure, that's the pressure limit minus the PEEP, times the inspiratory time divided by the total time plus the PEEP. Now let's return to Frank and plug in his numbers into this calculation. Remember his settings: an IP of 20, a PL, that's the plateau pressure, of 30, a PEEP of 10, all in centimeters of water, respiratory rate of 20, an inspiratory time of 1.5 seconds. And here is the calculation. So let's just work this out. Our total time is 60 divided by 20, so that's 3 seconds, and the mean airway pressure is 30 minus 10 multiplied by 1.5 over 3 plus 10, and that works out at a very generous looking 20 centimeters of water. That's quite impressive, and the main reason why this is so high is we are combining a high respiratory rate with a 1-to-1 I to E ratio. Let's explore that. In this situation, we have the similar settings to before, but I have inverted the breath. This is known as inverse ratio ventilation, so that the inspiratory time is now 3 seconds and the expiratory time is 1 second. The cycle time is exactly the same, it's 4 seconds, but inspiration is 3 times longer. Everything else, the PEEP, the inspiratory pressure, that is the driving pressure, and the rate is exactly the same. Now, when we look at this pragmatically, the PEEP is continuous and it is unchanged from before, but that area under the curve of the pressure waveform is much greater than before. So the mean airway pressure has to be higher. And if we plug in all these numbers into our calculation, this is what we get. In this case, the mean airway pressure has increased from 8.75 to 16.25 centimeters of water. Quite a dramatic increase. And remember, this is coming from a PEEP of 5 and a driving pressure of 15, resulting in a plateau pressure of 20. And that's what makes the mean airway pressure so significant, because it correlates with the degree of inflation of the lungs throughout the respiratory cycle. Also, it's worth keeping in mind, because we're using pressure control, that Auto-PEEP might exist. In this case, we've added Auto-PEEP of 3 centimeters of water, and this will increase the continuous PEEP to 8 centimeters of water, and of course will drop the driving pressure to 12 centimeters of water from 15, so that the tidal volume will be lower. If we feed this information into the calculation, you can pause the video now and do the calculation yourself. The result is surprising, because the impact of the Auto-PEEP at this level of mean airway pressure is minimal. It just goes up by less than 1 centimeter of water. The reason for this is the lungs are almost entirely inflated all the time because of this extraordinarily short expiratory time. So a slight increase in the continuous pressure really doesn't add a huge amount to the overall mean airway pressure. But it does have an impact in that it drops the tidal volume, it reduces the amount of ventilation, and will increase the partial pressure of CO2. In anybody in whom you are having to use inverse ratio ventilation like this, it is likely that those pressures will not be transmitted to the main vasculature and that you will tolerate high levels of CO2, but that's not always the case. And in fact, Auto-PEEP has much more of an impact on regular patients who have pressure control ventilation with normal I to E ratios. And in this setting, we've added the 3 of Auto-PEEPs, and now we have continuous pressure of 8 centimeters of water. Again, the driving pressure has fallen to 12, and as a consequence, the mean airway pressure has risen from 8.75 up to 11, and that's a relatively large increase in the mean airway pressure. And this will have an impact on the tidal volume, it'll have an impact on the PaCO2, it'll have an impact on venous return, and also the tendency here will be always to increase the respiratory rate because the CO2 has gone up if you don't look at the Auto-PEEP, and that will likely increase the mean airway pressure further, worsening ventilation and reducing the pH, causing vasoplegia. I'm going to take this topic a little bit further by looking at the elements that we can adjust on the ventilator and how they impact mean airway pressure in pressure control ventilation. Let's first look at PEEP and its impact on mean and plateau pressure. On the y-axis here we have airway pressure, and on the x-axis we have increasing levels of PEEP. The green dot is the starting point for PEEP, which is 0, and the red dot is the starting point for plateau pressure, which is 15. You can see that as PEEP increases, plateau pressure increases, and the mean airway pressure increases. The mean airway pressure tracking the plateau pressure linearly And that's what happens when you keep on pushing PEEP up without making other adjustments. Alternatively, you can leave the PEEP where it was at 5 centimeters of water and just progressively increase the driving pressure above where you started at 0. And let's see how that impacts. So you can see the plateau pressure, as the driving pressure goes up, the plateau pressure progressively goes up, but the mean airway pressure goes up quite slowly here because of the 1:3 I/E ratio, and as a consequence it doesn't track it as much and it doesn't go up as much as you might expect. Now we're going to lock the PEEP at 5 centimeters of water and the inspiratory pressure at 15, and we're going to vary the respiratory rate. Let's see what happens. Wow, this is really interesting because assuming that there's no Auto-PEEP, the plateau pressure does not increase at all, but the mean airway pressure rises progressively. And that's because with faster rates, the area under the positive pressure curve is increased. On top of that, in pressure control, we tend to lock in the inspiratory time. So with the fixed inspiratory time, every time you increase the respiratory rate, the expiratory time goes down. And so the relative ratio of inspiration to total cycle time in the calculation increases. Finally, let's look at increasing the inspiratory time while locking the PEEP at 5, the inspiratory pressure at 15, and the respiratory rate at 15. Again, you can see that mean airway pressure increases while the plateau pressure stays the same, reflecting in this case the progressively shorter expiratory time and the increased length of time under the pressure time curve. So the mean airway pressure can be increased by increasing respiratory rate or increasing inspiratory time or both, but it's not that simple. I've created a different graph here. On the y-axis, as before, we have a plateau or peak pressure, and on the x-axis we have mean airway pressure. Now, if we have a patient like Frank coming in and he's hypoxemic, we tend to increase PEEP using an FiO2 PEEP chart like the ARDS chart, and then, as I've shown you already, the descending pressure increases linearly. And as I've mentioned before, as plateau pressure goes in excess of 30 centimeters of water, we are in a danger zone for the patient due to the problem of ventilator-induced lung injury. So at this stage, you've run into a problem of trading off tidal volumes against airway pressure. You really have to reduce tidal volume to prevent ventilator-induced lung injury, for example, from 6 mils per kilo to 5 or 4 mils per kilo, and the result is a rise in the PaCO2, and the patient may be hypoxemic. The alternative is at some stage to stop increasing the PEEP and then increase the inspiratory time. And you can see here, as I've shown you in previous pictures, that the plateau pressure will stay stable as the increased inspiratory time goes on, but there comes a point where you run into trouble, and the trouble you run into is Auto-PEEP if the tidal volumes or the driving pressures are maintained. Again, in this setting, you can maintain that lower pressure by reducing the tidal volume to offset the Auto-PEEP. The alternative approach is to turn down the PEEP to offset the Auto-PEEP. And this is something that we do, for example, in airway pressure released ventilation, and this is a reasonable strategy, and I will explain that in detail later in the course. But always remember that when you're trading all these things off against each other, the big problem is expiration. And expiration is important because the major purpose of expiration is to release carbon dioxide from alveoli. We call that ventilation, and carbon dioxide is a poison, and it causes acidosis, and it causes all kinds of problems as it builds up in the body. But also expiration is required to allow the right atrium to fill, and I will cover this in a tutorial later in the course on heart-lung interactions. And if the atrium can't fill properly, then stroke volume falls and blood pressure falls. Very short expiratory times result therefore in hypotension due to low stroke volume and acidosis-induced vasoplegia, and of course auto-PEEP, which may impact both oxygenation and ventilation. I'm now going to move on to explain to you why increasing inspiratory time or mean airway pressure is very effective for improving oxygenation in severely hypoxic patients. The key message here is inspiratory time adjustment allows fine control of mean airway pressure. These are normal lungs in expiration. For example, the anterior apical segments are on the left, the posterior dorsal segments on the right. The PF ratio is more than 300. The PaCO2 is 40 millimeters of mercury or 5.1 kilopascals. When the patient inspires, every alveolus increases in size, but the greatest inspiratory incursion is in the posterior dorsal segments, as these started with the lowest volume. So these posterior dorsal alveoli have the greatest ventilation and the best ventilation perfusion matching. If you look at a volume pressure curve in normal lungs, the compliance is more than 100 mils per centimeters of water, and you can see that just minimum amount of driving pressure gives you very large tidal volumes. Now, these are diseased lungs in expiration. The anterior apical segments, as I've mentioned, are on the left and they're relatively spared. And as we progressively go to the right, you can see there's more and more and more disease in the posterior dorsal segments. Some of these are soggy, some of them are sticky, some of them have slimy material in them, but they're all diseased. So you have low lung volumes, you have a reduction in F4C, and this is going to result in hypoxemia. If we look at the volume pressure curve here, the curve is very, very flat and then just goes up at the end. So the compliance here is quite poor. With a plateau pressure of 30 centimeters of water, the compliance is only 15 mils per centimeter of water. Now, by applying PEEP at end expiration, we can prevent derecruitment of a not insignificant proportion of these lung units. You can see here the anterior apical segments are slightly overinflated, but they're well recruited. And as we go from left to right, there's better overall ventilation just associated with giving the patient PEEP. And this is what it looks like. By adding that 5 centimeters of water of PEEP, the same tidal volume is achieved with 20 centimeters of water of inspiratory pressure rather than the 30 that we had in the previous picture, as a consequence of improved volume pressure characteristics and better compliance. So the compliance here has improved to 22.5 mils per centimeter of water. Now, if we increase the PEEP to 10 centimeters of water, you'll find that we're getting the 450 mil tidal volume from 15 centimeters of water of driving pressure, and the compliance has improved to 30 mils per centimeter of water. So this just shows you how, by applying the appropriate level of PEEP to the patient, we can push that patient onto the favorable part of the volume pressure curve. So that's just like blowing up a balloon. It's very tough to get the balloon inflated initially, but once you get it inflated, if you don't let it deflate right back down again, you can get it reinflated quite easily subsequently. Now let's look at inspiration, and this patient is on 450 mils 15 times per minute, constant flow and volume cycle. So as soon as that 450 mils goes in, the patient cycles to expiration. You can see the patient has PEEP, and we're going to go ahead and give them 450 mils, starting off with a PF ratio of 130. Let's see where the gas goes. Gas will always pass to the most compliant lung unit. So that flow goes to the units on the left initially, and then gradually works its way towards lung units that have the least favorable flow characteristics, the longest time constant. Because this particular mode is volume cycle, once that 450 mils goes in, that's it. And so if nearly all that gas goes into the most easily inflated lung units and they become overdistended, some become recruited, then those lung units in the posterior dorsal segments don't see a lot of gas, they don't inflate, and as a consequence of this, very little gas changes over within these lung units. They still remain fairly small, even if they've been partially recruited by PEEP, and you get a lot of venous admixture. So this isn't great, and this is one of the problems with using volume cycle ventilation. It just goes in and it goes to the easiest place it can find. I call this phasic shunting during inspiration, or ventilation perfusion mismatch during inspiration, whereby lung units that are potentially recruitable don't see a lot of gas because there isn't sufficient time, or the flow characteristics are inadequate or inappropriate to inflate those lung segments. So the problem here is initial flow is too high, that's the Vmax on volume control, or the inspiratory time is too short, such as in volume cycle ventilation. To ensure that adequate gas distribution occurs through injured lungs that have lung units with different time constants, you can only improve this gas distribution by either increasing inspiratory time by applying an inspiratory hold or using a longer inspiratory time and pressure control, or by reducing the initial flow rate. I suppose you could also increase the respiratory rate, but that is problematic because of the issues with Auto-PEEP. So let's put this patient on pressure controlled ventilation, 15 centimeters of water, 15 breaths, a PEEP of 10, and a 2-second inspiratory time. So we're going to give them their driving pressure, 15 centimeters of water, and in the first second, you can see that the gas goes to where you would expect it to go, the most compliant lung units. And so those lung units are distended, some are recruited, and those ones with really poor time constants really remain underdistended. But what you're doing now is you're holding the gas in there for another second. Then in the second it starts to redistribute because there's back pressure from these lung units in the anterior apical segments that are overdistended, and the gas starts working its way through all kinds of lung units and starts to inflate those lung units with long time constants. And this really improves overall aeration, and it prevents phasic shunting during inspiration. And as a consequence, you get distension and redistribution and recruitment of lung units in the posterior dorsal segments. So you can see here the inspiratory hold that you apply in pressure control ventilation results in significant overall improvement in oxygenation. Let's just focus on these lung units with long time constants. As I've mentioned, due to medley problems, edema, secretions, blood, in order to get gas into the lungs, you need a lot of time. And there is phasic shunting in both inspiration and expiration. This can be partially curtailed by administering PEEP, and due to the waterfall effect, PEEP will eventually stent open these airways and ensure flow at the cost of increasing dead space and causing hypotension. On the other hand, we can apply longer inspiratory time and hold the lung units open for longer. The idea is that when expiration occurs, the stored up inspiratory pressure releases down to the PEEP level, which is relatively low. However, it's worth keeping in mind that long inspiratory times and high PEEP are not a great combination, because that results in extraordinarily high mean airway pressures and a loss of expiratory flow ramp. Remember that these lung units have long time constants in expiration also, and if you lengthen inspiration, you shorten expiration. As a consequence, the next breath is likely to be delivered before a significant number of lung units have resolved to resting position, and the consequence is auto-PEEP. Auto-PEEP is a problem because where tidal volume is fixed in volume control, the peak plateau pressure level will rise. In pressure control, the tidal volume will be lower than expected. Now, despite the fact that this is a tutorial on pressure control ventilation, and it's very easy to increase mean airway pressure and pressure control by just increasing the I to E ratio, by increasing the I time and reducing the expiratory time, you can also do the same thing in volume control, but you just need to be a little bit more skilled. The conventional approach to overcoming the problem of phasic inspiratory shunting and volume control is to increase the PEEP level, reduce the peak flow, and reduce the tidal volume and increase the respiratory rate. Here's our patient Frank on volume assist control. It's volume cycled with constant flow. He's received neuromuscular blockade, but although ventilating reasonably well, he's severely hypoxemic. Note three things. He's receiving 10 centimeters of water of PEEP. His tidal volumes are consistently 450 mils. This is volume control, of course. And thirdly, his peak pressure is 34 centimeters of water. We do know that this is plateau pressure is 30 by doing an inspiratory hold earlier on. So in order to improve oxygenation without damaging the lungs, we have to kind of figure something out. Frank is severely hypoxic. These are his settings: tidal volume 450, respiratory rate 15, PEEP of 5. He's got phasic shunting during inspiration. And I see it, we have four options. The first option is to turn him prone, which is the standard of care. We'll discuss this later on in the course. But if you can't turn him prone, then you need to look at some alternative approach. The second thing is to do nothing. If you're not sure what to do, don't do anything. He's probably fine. His PO2 is probably within life-sustaining limits. You know, the only reason why you're going to start doing more stuff to him is if you're concerned that it's going to fall further. The active approach you can then use is either to increase his PEEP, or secondly, leave the PEEP alone and increase his inspiratory time. In this situation, it's imperative to remember that maximum plateau pressure of 30 centimeters of water, and we're going to increase his PEEP up to 15 centimeters of water. Consequently, in order to keep Frank within safe pressure limits, the peak flow must reduce, the tidal volume must reduce, and the respiratory rate must increase. That increased respiratory rate will push up the mean airway pressure. The overall impact is improved oxygenation but worse ventilation. So you can see the PF ratio has gone up to 150, but the PCO2 has gone up to 65 or 8.5 kilopascals. There is an alternative, of course, and that is to increase the mean airway pressure by putting in an inspiratory pause. So we've put in an inspiratory pause here, and you can see by leaving the PEEP where it was and putting in an inspiratory pause, and now what we have is a 1-to-1 I to E ratio. We've managed to keep Frank within the safe pressure limits. We've left him with the same tidal volumes as before. We've reduced that peak flow to just make it easier to achieve without overpressurizing the airway, and the consequence here is a PF ratio of 150 with a lower PCO2 than with the faster rate and the lower tidal volumes. So he's oxygenating very well and he's ventilating very well, and this is the value of using an inspiratory pause in volume control, mirroring the increased I to E ratio that we were able to achieve in pressure control. So there isn't a huge amount of difference between volume and pressure control, just easier to do it in pressure control. So in summary, lung units with long time constants may not inflate during inspiration, and I call that phasic shunting during inspiration. Phasic shunting can be overcome by increasing the PEEP level. This improves oxygenation but worsens ventilation. It increases the dead space ratio because the tidal volume needs to reduce. It also may result in significant hypotension. Increasing inspiratory time, that's an increased I to E ratio, increases mean airway pressure without increasing the peak or plateau pressure level. This can be achieved in volume control ventilation, but frankly it's easier in pressure control. Let's review this tutorial. This tutorial was titled Primary Principles of Pressure Control Ventilation Part 2, and I principally focused on mean airway pressure and how it's calculated and why it's important and why it's a useful way of managing phasic ventilation perfusion mismatch during inspiration. We looked at methods of prolonging inspiration in pressure control and methods of increasing mean airway pressure by increasing respiratory rate, and we looked at the mean airway pressure in volume control as well as pressure control. Next time I will discuss pressure assist control ventilation, setting up pressure control, the advantages of pressure assist control, and the limitations of pressure assist control. Join me then, and I guarantee you'll learn something. So that's the end of the 2 tutorials on primary principles of pressure control. Next time we look at pressure assist control ventilation. If you're enjoying these tutorials, don't forget to subscribe at YouTube or follow me at ccmtutorials.org.